Hi, welcome to our first module, which is an introduction to neurodiversity. So to begin with, what is neurodiversity? It's a term that refers to the varied ways that people's minds work. Obviously, there's a lot of diversity and variety in how people think and communicate and process different types of information. And neurodivergence is a term that's often used to describe any way of thinking or communicating that is perceived to be outside of the norm. So examples of this could be autism, ADHD, Tourette's, acquired neurodiversity, intellectual disability, and so on. And one thing I like about this graphic is that under each category, it highlights strengths associated with each area. I think can be especially important because oftentimes neurodivergent individuals are described in terms of what's perceived to be a deficit or a shortcoming. Um, and the type of neurodiversity that we're going to be focusing on primarily in this presentation, just because it's what I'm personally most qualified to discuss, is autism. So autism is, uh, I guess, a nonlinear spectrum, really a multidimensional vector space. There's a variety of different autistic traits, and each autistic person is going to have a different intensity of each trait. Um, but these traits do generally fall under three main domains. So the first domain is social communication differences. This could be anything from differences in eye contact, differences with facial expressions, tone of voice, etc., preference for straightforward communication. And it can also encompass the type of language or whether one uses language at all to communicate or communicates in a different way. Um, Repetitive behaviors and intense interests is another category. Many autistic individuals really thrive with routine, and on the other hand, can find sudden changes in routine, especially anxiety-inducing or upsetting. And the final domain is sensory processing differences. So this really encompasses how someone perceives input such as light, sound, touch, etc. I wanted to take a couple of slides to briefly go through some common autistic strengths. And of course, each individual is going to be different, but many autistic individuals do have increased visual spatial abilities, skills with pattern perception or systemizing, and can also have really intense focus, which can sometimes be a great source of joy or enthusiasm and can allow them to acquire a lot of knowledge or expertise on a specific topic. And while I think that these abilities are certainly worth knowing and keeping in mind, I wanted to really highlight other common strengths that are maybe a little bit less academic or focused on productivity and that perhaps relate more to someone's personality or communication with others. Um, what's sometimes perceived as or labeled as being overly blunt or too socially different, I think can actually be often a refreshing, honest, straightforward communication style. I think one of the benefits of those who are blunt and direct is that you don't really have to guess what they're thinking because they'll tell you directly. You don't have to really guess if there's something that you need to read in between the lines of. And likewise, sometimes the relative obliviousness to social expectation can turn into a really positive willingness to question social norms and a tendency to think outside the box. Honesty is also often an autistic trait. And in some cases, autistic individuals can have really intense empathy that can, um, in some instances, turn into a lot of compassion and desire to help right injustices or help those who are struggling or in pain. One interesting recent article found that autistic individuals are generally less prone to the bystander effect, which maybe falls into the general theme of when going against social expectations can be a positive thing. So the bystander effect means that if you're in a crowd and someone needs help, but no one else is jumping in to help them, are you going to be the only one to jump in and help? And it seems that autistic people are maybe more likely to do that. Um, and some other research studies found that autistic individuals were quite likely to reject unethical bribes, and that was consistent both in public and in private. So I think that consistency and consistent adherence to ethics can certainly be a strength as well. Um, I also wanted to share kind of one last slide on the potential positive attributes of autism, which is autistic joy. I think it's important just to note that autistic people, certainly like all humans, can feel joy, and that sometimes autism itself can be a source of joy for a person. I really like this quote about how, for this person, the best thing about being autistic is being able to be so happy and so enraptured about things, that it leads into sort of a contagious joy. Um, a specific autistic trait that I wanted to go into that happens for many autistic individuals and can also be soothing for neurodivergent individuals more broadly is stimming. So stimming is a repetitive sensory input. As you can probably tell, I like to rock quite a bit, but other types of stimming could be hand clapping, repetitive noises, playing repetitively with jewelry or with one's hair could also be a type of stimming. And this can reduce anxiety. It can bring enjoyment and relaxation. It can help with the awareness of body position. And critically, it can also help with focusing. And the reason I emphasize the last point is because sometimes, especially in school or work settings, if someone is fidgeting or stimming, it can be misunderstood as if the person isn't focusing and we need them to sit still in order to focus. But in reality, allowing someone to stim or encouraging someone to stim or fidget can be exactly what they need to be able to focus in the optimal way for them. And I think this highlights kind of a deeper phenomena where it's really important to learn from autistic, neurodivergent, and disabled individuals about the reason or motivation for certain traits. So we're not suppressing things that are actually really helpful for the individual. So what is the root of these frequent miscommunications that often occur? One proposal is that it could be, at least in large part, due to the double empathy problem. So this is a phenomenon that was proposed in 2012, and it was initially described as a phenomenon of mutual misunderstanding. So the gist of it is that we know that oftentimes non-autistic individuals can communicate relatively easily with other non-autistic people. That doesn't mean that each pair of non-autistic individuals will be great friends necessarily, but they can at least, on average, convey their intentions and communicate without too many misunderstandings. And we also often know from experience, and research studies have also shown that autistic individuals and non-autistic individuals often have a communication barrier. Um, but what is maybe less known is that when pairs of autistic individuals communicate, they can also, on average, communicate relatively easily with each other. And this indicates that autism really is a kind of its own culture in a sense, or its own style of communication. And my guess is that the double empathy gap is really probably more accurately an infinite empathy gap because there's such a variety of experiences within the autistic community. I would conjecture that, for example, non-speaking autistic individuals might be able to even better understand each other than an autistic individual who's speaking might be able to necessarily understand a non-speaking autistic individual. So I think the way to bridge this barrier is to really emphasize the need to understand autistic ways of communication and the full variety of ways in which that can express. So one specific research study that looked at this was a study of first impressions in children, and they found that when autistic children were asked to rate their first impression of others in the study, they actually had the most positive first impressions when their peers had differences in eye contact. So, for example, less eye contact or had atypical facial expressions. And I think this is also worth noting because eye contact, much like fidgeting, is another frequently misunderstood area. It's kind of, I think, the default assumption, if we don't really bother to delve into neurodivergent experiences, is that encouraging children to make eye contact will allow them to connect better. But we can find from research that for autistic children, that's not necessarily the case. Having, for example, different or less eye contact in an interaction is often what leads it to be more positive. And that could be because eye contact is overwhelming. It could be because they're able to store that energy up and use it on other things. Um, but I think that this kind of sets the theme for the rest of our modules, which is understanding why autistic and neurodivergent individuals often have specific behaviors and how we can support those behaviors and communication styles as best as possible, while also finding, healthy and supportive ways to intervene if there is a safety issue, for example. Um, and finally, I want to kind of end with an example, with a definition of what it means to be neurodiversity affirming. Um, I think that one key aspect of this is supporting the self-advocacy and autonomy of the individual whenever possible, not necessarily defining success by how agreeable a child is, but by how well they are able to express their own needs and also respect the needs of others. Respecting the inherent worth of the individual, always making sure that we're not talking negatively about a child in front of them, as if they aren't going to be affected by that is just one example. Appreciating the diversity and the different ways of seeing the world, learning about autism from autistic individuals with different perspectives. And I wanted to note that, while I think that acknowledging strengths is certainly very important, being neurodiversity affirming is a much broader thing than simply using a strengths-based approach. And the flip side of that is that even in situations that are inherently difficult, for example, if a child is engaged in self-injurious behavior when they're overwhelmed, we can still use a neurodiversity affirming approach. It's not reserved only for situations that are a little bit more inherently positive. One example that I really love and use in a lot of presentations is this great example on bridging the gap in different communication styles. So I think this is an example of what neurodiversity affirming looks like in practice. An SLP had given a parent the homework assignment of spending a week observing and writing down all the ways her son showed her that he cared about her. So thank you very much for watching this module, and I hope you enjoy our module series.